Just been given the thumbs up, we're good to go. So, welcome, and thank you for joining us, those of you who are online, and particularly those of you who have joined us in person, taking the risk to be with us here tonight. I'm actually quite nervous myself. This is the first public talk I've given in person in over 2 years. I feel like I should start this conference by saying, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, but that would be a lie. I have no excuses. But I do have other excuses for why I'm so shabbily dressed tonight. There's something that I discovered after a year and a half of working from my kitchen, that the clothes elves have got into my wardrobe and shrunk all my trousers. So none of my suits now fit me, which is why I'm in chinos tonight. So apologies if I'm a little scrappily dressed. My name is Colm Lowe. I'm director of the Design Age Institute at the Royal College of Art. And we'll be joined today by Professor Jeremy Morrison, Professor Sarah Harper, and designers Georgia and Elliot here on the left, and Becky Rowe and Nick Palmieri and they will get a chance to introduce themselves later. A couple of bits of housekeeping. Masks are not enforced, but they are encouraged, particularly if you're up and wandering around in groups. There is no fire alarm for tonight, so if alarm does go off, please do make your way through the fire exits and follow the visitor experience assistants, if you can find them, to the exit point and the collection point outside the museum in front of the block of flats. For those people who might need the toilets, they are, if you haven't found them already, diagonally across the hall on your right. Please feel free to excuse yourself if you need to. So I'll start, if I may, with a brief introduction to the Design Age Institute, because we're still quite a new organisation. We were founded just over a year ago from a grant by Research England, and we are set to become the strategic unit for design and the healthy ageing economy. We have 5 partners in the Institute: the Oxford Institute of Population Ageing at Oxford University, the National Innovation Centre for Ageing at Newcastle University, the International Longevity Centre UK, the Design Museum, where we are today, and the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design at the Royal College of Art. Our remit is to provide research, education and design interventions to tackle age-related market failure, looking at supply and demand and helping older people live happier, healthier, longer and independent lives. And part of that remit is obviously advocacy, which is why we're here today, of course. And this event is part of the London Design Festival 2021. And today we're going to talk about designing a world for everyone. This is our agenda for today. We will be having a few talks, 2 or 3 talks, then a panel discussion, and then some Q&As. And I hope you'll find it stimulating, insightful, thought-provoking, but above all, enjoyable if you can. So on to the topic: why design a world for everyone? Well, the simple answer to that is we only have one life, with limited opportunities offered to us. And the years at the end of your life are just as important to the years at the beginning of your life, especially for those of us who are reaching the years at the end of our life. So our years are important also. But we're also running out of planet. We only have one planet with limited resources and space for all of us. In fact, I've always thought that the planet divides neatly into 2 parts. One part designed and created by Mother Nature, the other part created by people. And I believe that everything that people have created, in a sense, has been designed. So what I mean by that is somebody sat down with a problem, thought up a solution to that problem, and then brought it into being with the resources they had available to them. A very simple design process, but a design process nonetheless. So everything you see around you, from the roads you drive on, the cars, the fields, anything created by people has been designed. The problem is that lots of it has been designed badly. You don't tend to notice good design. It just sits there and does what it's supposed to do without getting in your way. For example, the chairs you are sitting on tonight, they are doing their job well. They seem to be relatively comfortable. They rest your legs. They allow you to pay attention for a little bit longer than you would do if you were standing. But if I come back to you in a week's time and say, what colour were they? You know, what was the material? How were they made? Who was the manufacturer? I bet very few of you would be able to answer that question with any certainty. But they are still good design. They do what they're supposed to do quietly in the background. Unfortunately, we notice bad design. Bad design gets in our way. We bang our shin off it. It frustrates us and it stops us doing the things we want to do. And a lot of bad design is created because it is not inclusive. It is not inclusive of the wide variety of people that we have in our society. And there's nothing worse than accidentally excluding people from the design process purely because you didn't get round to thinking about it. Because at worst, it can actually exclude entire segments from society and from commerce simply through a lack of attention from the designer and the design process. So inclusive design seeks to address this by including as many people as possible in the design process. It considers extreme user groups and those not in the majority, creating products and services without the need for special adaptation that are better for all to use. But the truth is, I am not going to speak too much about that because we have with us our first speaker, who is somewhat of a world expert on inclusive design. Professor Jeremy Myerson, Chair of Design at the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design. I first met Jeremy nearly 30 years ago when I was a young designer, and we took part in the first DBA product challenge. I think it was even called Design Age, the second DBA product challenge actually, where Jeremy and Roger Coleman walked into our office and fundamentally changed my career, because it became clear to me that design could be used for social good, not just choosing the next colour of a Kit Kat wrapper, as important as that may be. So Jeremy is not only an expert in designing a world for everyone, he has literally written the book, Designing a World for Everyone. And if you've not bought it, it's quite recently out. I would recommend you do buy one. Shameless plug. The check's in the post, I hope, Jeremy. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Jeremy Myerson.
Talking of shameless plugs, you've not heard it? Nothing yet. Thank you, Colm, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If some of you might be thinking that the phrase designing for your future self sounds familiar, that's because it is familiar. It's the term that was first adopted by the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design in the 1990s as a way to engage young designers at the RCA in the issues of ageing, to give them some skin in the game by designing their own futures. And I'm delighted that the new Design Age Institute has adopted this phrase, so it gets a new lease of life. Indeed, with our new venture, the whole story of design for aging gets a new lease of life. And the Design Age Institute, with its impressive range of partners, may be freshly minted, but the Royal College of Art's engagement with design for aging goes back a long way, 30 years in fact, to the first fledgling activities of what would become the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design. So, as Colm explained, during lockdown, I kept myself busy writing a book. You can see the cover here. It's called Designing a World for Everyone. It's newly published by Lund Humphreys. And it shows how inclusive design can have an impact on all aspects of our lives. From the redesign of a bus stop to make it easier to board a bus, to the design of a saucepan to make it easier for people with arthritis to cook. My aim was to chart the development of inclusive design over 30 years through the lens of the Helen Hamlin Centre's own projects in the field. So in the book, what I've done is take 30 everyday objects and environments, A for airport, W for wheelchair, so on and so forth, to show how inclusive design can improve people's health and well-being. And as our centre started life in 1991, under the direction of Roger Coleman as the Design Age programme, many of these projects focus on people as they age. Now, the book opens with a story from one of our earliest industrial collaborations with the British Airports Authority, who were developing the new Terminal 5 at Heathrow. And this had the slogan, the world's most refreshing transport interchange, but they were really worried about the demographic of the travelling public and the fact that it was on 2 levels and the fact that it was so large that they were worried about wayfinding. And we were brought in to do research with older travellers and people with sight loss and hearing loss to see how they would cope. And we used the existing Heathrow estate to examine how people were negotiating the airport environment. And I had a meeting with senior managers from British Airports Authority to describe our ethnographic research, and I explained to them that they said, well, what have you learnt? And I said, older people go to the toilet a lot. And they fell about laughing and said, well, tell us something we don't know. And I said, well, do you know why they go so often? Actually, they go to the loo to hear flight announcements. They have trouble listening to flight announcements or reading information in the large, busy, open concourse. And ceramic-clad toilets have perfect sound, close-up graphics, so they can concentrate. So this led to a proposal from the design team I was leading, working alongside Nigel Coates at the RCA, to create acoustic arches in Terminal 5, small independent pieces of microarchitecture within the concourse, lined with ceramic tiles. And these information booths, or caves, are today commonplace in many European airport terminals. They're usually branded by advertisers. They sell coffee or perfume, and they're popular with passengers of all ages. And I think this story reflects our early ethos in the centre, that older people should be part of the mainstream and not marginalised in a special needs ghetto. And indeed, what the book does is try and chart the dynamic shifts in design for healthy ageing. So when we started, when Roger and I co-founded the centre, we encountered a world around older people that was very aids and appliance based. There was a quick fix on kind of solutions. It was all about usability and usefulness and function. It was about physical access to the built environment. It was very much about physical health and frailty. And it was about reducing barriers to make life at least tolerant, getting rid of some of the friction. But over time, what happened is that inclusive design landscape changed. We started looking more at services and systems. We took a deep dive into the problem. We dwell on the problem rather than jumping to a solution. We went from usability to desirability. It's not enough just to be tolerable. We explored wider issues of social inclusion and not just physical access to the built environment. The digital realm became as important as the physical. And we were about not just reducing friction and barriers, but actually bringing a therapeutic element to inclusive design that would allow people to retain capacity and build resilience. I just want to show you in a couple of projects from the book, just to show you a couple of these shifts. So this was a typical project in the centre from 1994, actually, when we started, the year that Roger defined the term inclusive design, around an appliance. So this is with Safeway supermarket and Rockware glass, and it's a great solution. It's a square lid on a jam jar to allow you to grip it and turn more easily. But within 15 years, we were engaged in a complex redesign of the whole system of emergency mobile healthcare in the UK, working closely with patients and paramedics to rethink the ambulance interior. And these services are disproportionately used by older people. So the London ambulance was dark and intimidating, difficult to clean, inefficient. And we introduced natural daylighting, stretcher placed in the centre of the vehicle to get 360-degree access, just-in-time treatment packs, a digital diagnostic system, and curved plastic interior panels for easier cleaning. And actually, coming to the Design Museum reminds me that this design won the Design Museum Transport of the Year, Design of the Year in 2012. So we moved from products to systems. We also moved from usability to desirability, probably best viewed through our work around bathroom design. For older people, the usual emphasis in the bathroom is safety, sterility, anti-slip mats, easy grip handles and so on. Never on sensuality, but bathing is an essential grooming activity. It's about looking good and feeling good, whatever your age. So we developed new environments that were focused on the more indulgent and desirable aspects of bathing. And when we showed, we were working with Ideal Standard and Studio Levine, and when we showed the Ideal Standard engineers these ideas, they kind of gulped a bit. They wondered where the plug hole was. But we actually took into production some of the work. This is a basin and mirror combo based on ethnographic research with older dancers and actresses. This shift from usability to desirability was complemented by a movement into broader ideas of social inclusion and tackling the taboo subject for many years for designers. They couldn't understand how design could work with cognition, with mental health. And this is a project called Our Future Foil, which you'll find on the front cover of the book, in which our team has redesigned an entire riverfront, a 6-mile stretch along the River Foyle in Derry, Londonderry in Northern Ireland. We worked extensively with the local community to redesign the riverfront. And on the actual river itself, to create a physical suicide barrier, we put up an art installation. It's based on the natural reeds that occur in the landscape around the site. And it's an interactive system of 12,000 digital reeds which change colour and brightness as people walk along. You can adopt a reed and have an app and change your own reed, the colour of it, creating a great sensory experience. And also, going from a suicide black spot, a place of poor mental health, to what will be the largest installation in Northern Ireland when it's completed. And another aspect of the project along the riverbank is these community pods. They're called foil bubbles, to attract local businesses and footfall to the area, create natural surveillance through people being around. So many of our projects in recent times have had a digital dimension, none more so than the Great British Toilet Map, that allows older people to find a publicly accessible toilet when out and about, based on forcing local authorities to give up open data and putting it all into a digital system. More than 500,000 people have actually used this app, and it lists nearly 14,000 toilets from more than 400 local authorities. And it's ironic, isn't it, that we've got access to the built environment through digital space. And then finally, the idea of the shift from reducing barriers to building capability and resilience. Best seen in our kitchen projects. We work with Arthritis Research UK in London. Our research team engaged with a range of ethnic and cultural backgrounds, people with different degrees of arthritis. And yes, we did produce some aids and appliances, like an integrated chopping board and grater for one-handed use. But we discovered that the best form of therapeutic intervention was to keep people exercising their hands by challenging their dexterity. And to do this, we created a hand-healthy recipe book of traditional meals that require persistent hand movements, such as kneading dough, translating the everyday activity of cooking into an accessible form of therapeutic exercise. So, very quickly, a quick kind of opening overview of some of the shifts in design for healthy aging that I've experienced over the last 30 years and which have been captured in this book. I think in conclusion, I'd say that that the focus on designing for our future selves, looking back over the projects, the most effective ones combine three things. They combine social activism, a belief that age and ability are social constructs, that people are disabled only by their environment, and that inclusive design is the way forward. Intense collaboration with business, with community groups, and academic partners. And creative design. If we believe in the power of design to make a difference, then we need to put design and designers front and center. So a few things as an opener to throw into the mix I'm going to hand you now back to Colin. Thank you.
Again, for anybody who hasn't taken a flick at Jeremy's book, it is a fantastic collection of projects and a fantastic look that demonstrates, if nothing else, the power of the possible. And if you really put your mind to it, it's amazing what you can pull off. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce you to is Professor Sarah Harper. Sarah is Clore Professor of Gerontology at the University of Oxford and Director of the Oxford Institute of Population Ageing. I first met Sarah not very long ago, in fact on the interview panel when I was offered the job of Director of the Institute, and I'll have to admit I was just a little bit terrified. Didn't tell her at the time, in fact I'm only telling her now, but I think I knew a little bit about design and inclusive design, but that's nothing compared to Sarah, who is a world expert on ageing. You don't have to spend much time researching ageing before you come across Sarah and her work. However, I quickly discovered there was nothing to be terrified about. Sarah is generous with her knowledge, patient with those of us who are less expert than she is, and makes her work accessible to the widest possible audience. And so, please welcome Professor Sarah Harper.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Colin. It's been absolutely fantastic for us at Oxford to be involved in the Design Age Institute and to get to know Colin as he has built it already so successfully. Before I start, I also just want to pay real tribute to Jeremy Marson, because I first met Jeremy about 15 years ago. He has been tremendously influential at the Institute in Oxford and with other social scientists about different ways of understanding the world. We know the fantastic job he did at Helen Hamlin, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the huge achievement, Jeremy, of actually getting the funding to set up the Design Age Institute. Jeremy and I were on a government review which looked at the ageing of the UK population, and we were all very much taken. We were very multidisciplinary, but Jeremy was very much the star on that committee, so much so that when I was on the Prime Minister's Council, it was really pushed by the government that what we needed was a national centre for design, and Theresa May backed it completely, but it was Jeremy who ran with it. So Jeremy, you've done another fantastic thing, and we are all very grateful to you for that. Okay, I'm going to talk to you I think about demography and design. So I'm sitting with all these mainly designers. As I say, I'm a social scientist. I trained as an anthropologist and then moved into demography with particular interest in ageing. And I'm just going to take you through some of the ideas that we have around social science, behaviour. We're going to look at some of the ideas about making our societies more resilient and how design, hopefully, can contribute to that. So this was my brief, Designing a World for Everyone, looking at the latest research and insights in a post-COVID society. So what I want to do is talk about what we know, what has changed, basically over the last 18 months, and what we can do now in, I wouldn't say a post-COVID world, but definitely in a world that has been shaken up by a pandemic. So, first of all, I owe this slide to a colleague of mine at the University of Copenhagen, Lena Rasmussen. I'm a guest professor there. Lena is a biologist and has really introduced me to an understanding of how the cell and the environment are so linked. In the last 5 years, we've had a tremendous progress in understanding the relationship between cellular and individual ageing and societal ageing. Very, very simply, we know ageing is malleable. We know that healthy behaviours can prevent chronic conditions and slow down functional design. And we know that stressors, retirement, bereavement, disease, which we tend to increase as we get older, they can actually impact at the cellular level, but we have resilience. We have exercise, diet, social networks, etc. So I think we know this and we really know the mechanisms. We know that there are differences between generations, cohort effects, and we also know that there are differences within generations, their socioeconomic effects, and we really understand inequality is at the basis of many of the ways in which we now understand healthy ageing and inequalities in healthy ageing. We know that most of the risk factors are reinforced across the life course, so a life course approach is really important. And finally, as an ageing population, we must have a multidisciplinary approach, and we must work towards integrated systems. And that's why for us as social scientists, to work with designers has been so exciting. So let's really quickly whip through some demography here. We're going to look a little bit at individual ageing, but we're also going to look at population ageing. This is life expectancy at age 60. It's almost pointless in high-income countries looking at it any earlier because everybody, not everyone, but almost everyone lives to 60. In fact, half the population in high-income countries now makes it to about 80. And you can see at the top we have Japan, and we have Spain, and we have France. The solid lines are women, the dotted lines are men. And you can see basically that the Mediterranean and East Asian countries dominate. We drop down to the UK, which is in yellow, and then we have the US. And we really do understand the influence of diet and exercise, probably vitamin D, social networks, etc. We think the trend will continue upwards. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID. We think huge inequalities within particularly the UK and the US is dragging our life expectancy down at the population level. Although high-income groups are still increasing their life expectancy, we know that low-income groups, that's actually falling for women and flattening for men. And we also believe that women will always live longer than men for all sorts of biological reasons. How long are we going to continue to live? Lots and lots of longevity data out there now. This is just one which I love. It was published in The Lancet. It comes from the Human Mortality Database. And what they did was they modelled the oldest age at which at least 50% of a birth cohort would be alive. And they suggest that the 2007 birth cohort, they will make it to 107 in Japan. That's half of them will live to 107. And we have France, I think it's Italy, and the US 104. We're coming in at about 103. As a consequence, huge amounts of research now on centenarians. This is some modelling that we did in Oxford. We have roughly 15,000 centenarians at the moment. By 2050, if you look at the green line, which is the total, we will have heading towards 500,000, and we will have 1.5 million nearly by the end of the century. So we did this modelling, my colleague George Leeson, and we said, George, you're crazy, and then DWP and ONS came up with almost identical modelling. So we're pretty sure that that ageing of the population will probably continue. We also really understand the absolute impact of inequality, not only in life expectancy, which you're all aware of, everyone has heard of the Whitehall study, the difference between Glasgow, Kensington, example, but also in healthy life expectancy. This is some modelling that we did for the government with ONS data. Basically, these are areas of deprivation. On this side, we have the most deprived. On the far side, we have the least deprived. This is life expectancy and healthy life expectancy for men aged 65. And the way to interpret it is 65-year-old men living in our most deprived areas will probably make it to 80, but they will go into ill health at 70. All their 70s are going to be in ill health. If, however, you live here in Kensington and you're a man aged 65, you probably will live to into your late 80s, and you will not go into ill health until you reach 80. So huge inequality, not only in life expectancy, but also healthy life expectancy. And I'll just show you one more figure on this. This is a wonderful study that was published in The Lancet. And the way you have to interpret that, on this side we have the incidence of heart failure. Along the bottom we have it by year. And then we've done it by socio-economic quintile. In other words, at the bottom we have men who are living in the least deprived. At the top we have men who are living in the most deprived. Exactly the same pattern, but we have a huge drop, nearly a fifth, purely because of inequality within our system. All we have to do is raise those bottom ones up to the same level as men in this part of the world, for example, and we would dramatically reduce heart failure. And that is why Theresa May's statement, which seems to have been abandoned, that she wanted to add 5 years of healthy life onto everybody, was so significant. This was going to be by 2035. Let's hope the government turns back to it. Okay, we talk about preparing for our future selves. I'm afraid we pinched it about 10 years ago from the Helen Hamlin Centre. What has changed? This is a very quick look at what we think COVID has done. We're going to start with demography, but then we're going to move on to society. Huge outpouring of research into impact of COVID on life expectancy, the vast majority of it absolutely unfounded. I edit a journal, all my colleagues who edit journals, we were inundated. We rejected 75% of the stuff that came in. People jumped on the bandwagon. What do we know now, 18 months on? Okay, this is some US data, very sensible data. We think the decrease in US life expectancy has been roughly 1.5 years, and that translates to a reversion of 14 years in life expectancy. Particularly, this also represents ethnicity, because black men in the States in particular have had a dramatic fall. And although the gap between black and white men had been reduced, it's been completely erased due to COVID, and there is an argument about how long it will take to come back. We see the same in England. Very sensible, good founded data came out of Public Health England just this month. We think 1.3 years have been lost. We have men on this side, and this is just different months. They've just taken different 6-month periods, but you can basically see the downfall that happened between January and June 2019 into 2020 or 2020. You can also see women, exactly the same pattern, but women lived longer than men, and that was also reflected. We really have, I think, gained a lot of understanding about ethnic differences and gender differences over the last 18 months. It's been very, very valuable. We knew that women in general had a 5-year advantage over men. If we looked at the modelling of all chronic diseases, women tended to become ill later and to die later. Women at every age have a lower risk of morbidity. Across the globe, men have lost nearly 50% more years than women. So women in general have been older at COVID death. 71 was an average for men, 76 for women, and this is an 81-country study. So we think life expectancy has gone down. We think it will rebound, and I'll show you a very quick graph about that in a minute. But this, I think, is the really important thing. We know that because of COVID, our healthcare systems in high-income countries have suffered. We also know chronic diseases and treatment for chronic diseases have suffered. Only today, there was a paper that came out which suggested that we could potentially have 10,000 extra cancer deaths in this country because 40,000 people have either not had treatment or not screening. And we don't know how long this effect will continue. We also don't know the impact on long COVID. We used to think that it was quite severe, particularly among young people. Early indications, in fact, that it isn't that serious, but we're not sure. So these are the negatives. What about the good news? Because I think there is some good news. If you look at some of the data on last winter, it is very clear that the lack of influenza, which also kills older adults, actually reduced the overall deaths, although there was a slight increase due to COVID. Now, one of the things the government is very worried about is that influenza and COVID will be out there, and that's why we're all being told if you're over 50 to get a flu jab. But some of the virologists are saying, no, there's competition. And in fact, either influenza will come one year or COVID will come one year. And so influenza may continue to be low whilst COVID is dominant, and influenza may push COVID out of the way in future years. So that potentially could be good news. I would also say our knowledge has improved significantly around our understanding of diseases. We really understand morbidity by characteristics. The gender and the ethnicity aspects have really been studied over the last 18 months. Personalised medicine, I think, has had a huge boost from the data we've been able to collect. The immune system response of older adults, masses of research has now gone into that, and that can only have a benefit. And immunisation and chronic diseases, particularly with these the new mRNA vaccines, which were very much sort of sitting there and have had a tremendous boost, but they're not the only ones. And it's very likely that we will be vaccinating against things like cancer within the decade. So this is what we saw in 2019. In 1919, you can see the flu epidemic there, that big V down. Will we bounce back in that way? We may. However, remember, we didn't have advanced medical systems then, And it is likely that because of the tremendous impact on our healthcare systems and on chronic diseases, it may take longer for us to bounce back. So it's a bit of a mixed message. But I think in the long term, we believe that life expectancy will continue. I think the second thing we have to be aware of is a tremendous awareness of ageism. Ageism has been there, no one's taken it seriously, but tremendous attention has been paid to ageism. Care homes, excess deaths, do not resuscitate notices. The coronavirus containment, do you remember anybody over 70 was told to shut themselves away? Huge amounts of discussion. Was this pragmatic policy making to save older adults, or did it reflect institutional ageism? This, I think, is something that got less attention, but in the professional bodies, a huge amount of attention. Without discussion or permission from older adults or their families, do not resuscitate notices were put on older adults without their knowledge and without the family's knowledge. So much so that UK Amnesty International said that there was do not resuscitate at GPs, in the clinical commissioning groups, in hospitals and in care homes. And as a result, the entire professional body, I don't think there was a single professional body that worked with older adults from the medical through to the social that did not openly write objecting to this. The negative stereotyping, prejudice and discrimination towards older adults during the pandemic has led to worse healthcare and increased death. And that was a consistent message that people were coming out of. And I think that awareness of ageism is probably a very good thing. Not what was happening, but this awareness. The third area, of course, is this. And this really leads into the kind of things that the Design Age Institute are going to be working on. How we work has been transformed and probably transformed forever. I think you all heard on the news that the government has now said that all new contracts have to have flexible working in them. Put that together with Brexit and the fact that in this country at least there's going to be a massive skill shortage, which is going to creep up from the workers we see at the moment and eventually will affect the professional managerial middle classes, and young people are going to be able to choose. Flexible working is here to stay. How we care, we know that there has been the whole sort of tele area has really had a boom over the last 18 months. Robotics, in fact, one of our partners on the Design Age Institute works with AI and healthcare. This is a really sort of booming area. We will be caring differently in the future. And of course, how we consume. So, three things: demographics, societal attitudes, and actually how we live and work have all been affected by COVID. So what can we do? There are many, many things we can do, but I'm just going to talk about one thing which I think will lead on to something that the Design Age Institute wants to promote with the Design Museum immediately after this talk. This is my book. This is another book. I wrote a book in 2006 called Aging Societies, Myths, Challenges and Opportunities, and they asked me to update it, and in the end I also spent lockdown rewriting a book. And this is Aging Societies, Risk and Resilience, and I don't have time to go into it, but I have to say the whole concept of resilience, I was very informed by the design world, which then moved into the ecology world and is now in the social science world. And what the book really is saying is how can we ensure resilient individuals and resilient societies in the light of individual and population aging? So, three things. Number one, we have to address ageism. And in fact, the UN report on global ageism came out in 2021. And they argue very strongly changes in policy and laws, intervening through educational activities, and this is the really crucial bit, sustaining and increasing intergenerational contact. Before I go on to that, the second one is become inclusive. And again, we've been very much influenced by the work of the Helen Hamlin Centre. We have to build a movement to change the narrative around age and ageing, and definitely this is something that Colm has very much taken up as one of the flagship things that he wants to pursue, and we have to be inclusive and include marginalised voices. But this, I want to conclude on, is the thing that we at Oxford are working most on, which is reuniting the generations. Interaction between the generations, we know, improves well-being and mental health for both young and old. It promotes healthy aging. And I think this is, as an anthropologist, very interesting. Intergenerational communities, the research shows us that building around an exchange of resources between young and old, the really important thing is that both feel they need the others and that they in turn are needed by them. All the social science research has suggested that one of the things about growing old that's often neglected is that you don't feel needed anymore. You don't have a role or a purpose. Intergenerational communities very much can fill that. If we put that with the how has the world changed, then you can see how we can start reintegrating intergenerational communities back into mainstream societies. We used to live intergenerationally. We used to live in multi-generational households and communities. It's only in the last 100, 150 years that they've been so separated. This is something I wrote for Wired at the beginning of the year, where we were looking at what is going to change in 2021. Already before the pandemic, offices were changing, people were downsizing. Cities, London, Paris, New York, we had so much evidence that these big office blocks were beginning to be questioned. So let's take advantage of the need to convert office and retail space in order to build new residential communities. And that is one of the things at Oxford that we are beginning to do quite a lot of work on, to ensure that we then will have intergenerational communities right in the centre of our cities. But you need to be proactive about it. The market is going to do something very different, but if there is a movement to say we turn these into intergenerational spaces, then I think that is where a very strong message comes from. And we have got so many examples popping up in different parts of the world where right in the centre of our cities, office spaces are being converted into intergenerational living. So one of the things that the book says is design, facilitate and support intergenerational communities. We're very grateful to Design Age Institute to enable us to do this research, working very closely with their researchers. And hopefully that just gives you a sort of overview of how we at Oxford, working with DAI, think we can make a better world post-COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. As always, wow, and a little overwhelmed with information, dense with information and insight. So no matter how many times I hear Sarah speak, I always come away learning quite a lot of new things, so thank you. And now to our final speakers, Georgia Cottington and Elliot Lunn. I don't know whether you have a book, but it seems to be your turn. If you have one, feel free to get it out. Georgia and Elliot are both RCA 2020 graduates in MAs in design products. They have been working with the Design Age Institute and the Design Museum, developing an intergenerational community garden. Thank you, whoever did that. At the museum, they've been working here at the museum on this intergenerational community garden, which demonstrates the power of healthy aging design. And the project is a year-long collaboration that will start with a consultation with local community groups, working with older people in Kensington and Chelsea. Georgia and Elliot are leading the consultation and will be sharing a short activity with you all. You should all have been given cards, I think, as part of the activity, which I hope you'll enjoy. Welcome, Georgia and Elliot.
Yeah. Sorry, we don't have a book.
But we do have a postcard.
Yeah, you get this instead. Yeah, so like we just said, we are Georgia and Elliot, a design duo who met at the RCA, and we are working with the Design Museum on their Growing Together project, which is establishing an intergenerational garden in the garden area that you might not have noticed before at the sort of back of the museum. And we are running a series of workshops with local community groups to make connections with groups that wouldn't necessarily always feel welcome or access the museum. Go.
So these workshops are to be run with a range of communities within Kensington that
I work with older people.
Work with older people, yeah.
And some younger people too.
So the important thing for us was trying to bring the garden to these communities. The workshops will be in different spaces and either in different medias. So we are running some on Zoom, we're running some at the Design Museum, and we are running some at the community's locations. So it was important to create something that allowed them to understand what they're looking at. So we are doing this through a model and a series of images of the space. And even when you're in the space, you kind of realize that it's quite hard to imagine what the space could be, because at the moment it's quite overgrown. And these communities need to kind of work out what they could do with the space and the potential it has, and where these kind of images line up. So you can see the garden breaking down into these zones of sort of a patio space, this sort of metal area, ventilation area, and then a flatter top area where the trees are, and we also have some sort of garden growing spaces in there. And within these workshops we will present the model, these images, and then hopefully with some get the chance to bring them into the space and ask them what they want to do with it and what boundaries may face when they're there.
Yep, another tool that we're using as part of the workshops is these postcards that have an image of the space and then a provocation on the back. And we wanted to ask this group of people who are all interested in intergenerational and how to design for ageing populations, what you think is important when creating an intergenerational garden as part of our research. So we want to invite you to respond in any way you want. You can draw, write, anything to respond to this question. And any people that are online, there's an online form that you can click in the description, and we will be just outside the room to collect these at the end of the talk. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
And maybe George and Elliot didn't make it clear, you'll not be allowed to leave unless you do fill in something in your cards. We have people on the door to check. And again, those online, please do make an effort while we go into the next stage just to fill in some answers for us, give our guys some information. That would be great. Thank you, George and Elliot. A great illustration of user-centered design process, which I hope you all got something out of. And now, for the next section of our agenda, our panel discussion, if our panel could come up and join us. We have pulled together a panel of experts from very different fields to provide their thoughts on how we design a world for everybody. There is a couple of absentees from our initial list. So Manisha Patel and Paul McGarry can't make it tonight for health and COVID reasons. And Sarah has very kindly agreed at last minute to step in and form part of the panel as well. So if we could just, rather than me talking, if we could all introduce ourselves to the audience. Becky, maybe I could start with you.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm owner and head of research at Revealing Reality. We're a social research agency, and I'm an ethnographer and psychologist. Out of all of the panel, I'm not an expert on ageing, but I am an expert on all the things that stop us thinking about ageing. So that will be my perspective tonight.
I'm Jeremy. I am my own case study now. But as well as being at the RCA, I'm also a visiting professorial fellow at Sarah's unit at Oxford University.
I'm Sarah Harper, and I started as an anthropologist and then became a demographer and have worked in ageing.
Fantastic. Nick?
Hey, I'm Nick Palmarini. I'm the director of the UK National Innovation Centre for Ageing, which is based in Newcastle. I spent basically the last 15 years working in IBM research for innovation and technology for the older adults and how this innovation can help us live healthier, longer life. And I discovered I have a blue background with Sarah.
I'm an IBM family. My father worked for IBM all his life.
Here we are.
and sent one of those early emails that you all heard about yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we've got a few questions that we're going to ask first, but feel free, there will be a Q&A session after this, either online and from the audience, we hope. But the first question I'd like to ask is to dig into that COVID question a bit more. And Becky, I'm going to come to you first. What do you think are the opportunities of designing age-friendly and inclusive sort of homes, public spaces, environments that coming out of COVID will provide for us?
It's a really good question. I think there are a whole range of things. There's one thing I want to say about the general condition that we're seeing around empathy at the moment, and obviously being an ethnographer, promoting empathy and bridging the empathy gap is something that I am passionate about and I do in all of my work. But what I'm seeing is a change in the amount of emotional energy people are willing to give to others, because some of their emotional energy has been taken up on themselves, and that focus on self has become a bit of a habit over the last 18 months and 2 years. And so people like me, we'd spent a lot of our careers focusing on other people, and suddenly we got permission to think about the impacts on us. And actually I think one of the biggest challenges coming out of COVID is actually changing our mindset from focusing on ourselves to actually on other people. In terms of answering your specific question, I do think we've all now had a slice of an experience of loneliness and what it feels like to maybe be disconnected from people that you are connected to. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity for us all to have some empathy with what loneliness and isolation feels like, especially in older age, and for us to keep that feeling and think about how we want older people to remain connected and try and avoid those issues as we get older.
Look, we're going to run over you as well, because we haven't heard you talk yet. This idea, I like the idea of the empathy gap, but yet we've all got a bit of empathy now of what it's like to be isolated. And I know you're working on things like cargo bots and things like that.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I guess, isolation is a matter that is across all the generations first. So this is a good point for intergenerational design, I guess. It's not only for the older people. The effects could be different, but I think it's important that we consider that something that it's happening in all the stages of life. The second thing is the pandemic suggested us something that Sarah said very well before. We realized how ageist is the world in which we're in. The narrative, as you all know, was we are all somehow not all, but the older people expendable at the end of the narrative. It was such a given that you could give them away first. And basically in the beginning nobody said a word about it, which is somehow something that we consider this normality as one of the things that should have to allow us to think what we have to do. And I know the job we are all together doing, but obviously the Design Age Institute is pushing a lot about writing a new narrative, which means pulling out the word ageism out of the academia, because it's something quite obvious and known, not obvious, but known very well, let me say, inside the academic institutions. But it's not so for the public. It's one of the most deep unconscious bias that we have, and the only way to make it aware to others is just to show it. Just one thing to let you know, I'm Italian, as you can probably guess from my accent. The word ageism doesn't exist in Italian. So there is a discrimination in the word itself, because it's an Anglo-Saxon word. So it's being translated in Italian as ageismo, but age as a word in the Italian vocabulary doesn't exist. So if I go there and say, you're all ageist, in Italy, they look at me and say, what the hell are you talking about? Should be etaismo. So you have, just to tell you how much this discrimination is young and unknown, has been coded in 1969. Check out sexism and racism, which are not solved at all, but at least we'll start recognizing them quite clearly, not for the age. So I think it's something that the pandemic raised up as one of the a key point probably from which we can learn how to explain others what's happening out there. And the last point I just wanted to highlight specifically on your question, I really like when Jeremy showed an application showing where the toilets are. We're working with Design Age Institute to, let me say, leverage existing design, and specifically in this case are walking robots, and understand if walking robots could be helpful for an aging demographic. And one thing that came out from our research, which was very interesting, is that a walking robot could be a place where you can sit down on top of which. You have to see the robot to understand what I'm talking about. But what is interesting is that this idea that design is fluid and flexible is leading us not to think about things which are placed in the space. So I invite all the designers to think in a more, I would say, dynamic way, meaning that instead of putting benches somewhere in a city, the robots can be the benches. So the benches can be movable around. And we know the story that by data that older adults tends not to go somewhere if they don't know if they can sit down or there is a toilet nearby, going back to Jeremy's point. So why don't we bring the bench with us? So think about how robots and design and things that we could see as distant from us in terms of technology, and sometimes we avoid to think as a real aid could be rethought in so many different ways up to become a bench that follows you instead of having a bench that is fixed there and you can't move it from there. So I think the possibilities of design, the possibilities of production, and combined with technology, with all the knowledge that somehow Sarah pushed us clearly in our face, are suggesting us very different way on how we can rethink the way we approach design for an older demographic.
And it's interesting that products like that kind of existed before. The old walking stick or golfing stick with the folds on the seat, which seems to be totally out of fashion, and you don't see them anymore. But these problems have existed for a long time, but the solutions come and go and disappear. But you mentioned this thing about ageism, and I'm keen to ask Sarah because I know she'll know something about this that I don't, probably a lot that I don't. But inside us all, we have a deeply programmed bias on aging, and to the point where just being old is uncool. Quite literally, that idea of being old doesn't sell anything. And I'm just wondering, do we see a change in that happening, or is that something that we think might grow, or is anybody tackling it?
I mean, there is a huge amount of research around ageism, and I think what Nick said is very true. We are revolted by sexism and racism, but ageism is somehow natural.
Yeah.
We can say things, and if you took that word out and put the word black in rather than old, you would be horrified that you were saying it. And I think you have this idea that there are East Asian societies and there are traditional societies that care for their older adults, and in the West we don't. That's just not true. Most societies care for wise, powerful people, but when they become frail and disabled, even traditional societies and Eastern societies tend to push them away. And there has been a lot of research. Part of it is fear of frailty and disability, and within yourself you're internalizing the fact that I might become like that. Part of it is around the contribution to society. We know that historically families did care for each other, but if it was a matter of an old person going into the workhouse or their children, they would always put the old person in. So part of it is, I think, something to do with the passing of time and the passing of status and attributes down through generations. But in today's society, we've sort of linked that to chronological age, and that is what is so wrong, is that when we started having these state pension ages and then we had state retirement ages, we had this idea that anyone in their 60s, and then it became in their 50s, well, they're sort of useless, and suddenly that's when old started. And so there is a really big movement. I mean, the UN has really engaged with this, and all the big NGOs are now really engaging with it. And that one of the things we talk about, we really push this idea of older adults. You don't just say the elderly or even old people, you say older adults. These people are adults. They're fully adults in the way that we all are adults once we achieve that. And I think it's really important that if you like, that we probably will all have a very short period of frailty at the end of our lives, if we are lucky. And at that stage, we should be thinking about old. But up until then, we are contributory adults in whatever way. It may not be in the workforce, but it may be within families or caring responsibilities. My mother died 3 years ago at 92. She lived with us for the last 2 years. She really was getting very frail. Huge contributor to her family. The things that my children learned from being with my mother was just huge. So I think it really is accepting frailty at the end of life, but forgetting about chronological age, which has really muddied the water.
Yeah. And Jeremy, you've been in this business for 30 years. You've published a book. Have you seen attitudes change in that 30 years about, do clients now queue up at your door because they're interested in the subject, or is it still a bit of a hard sell to get people interested?
Well, it's hard to really say decisively that people are more interested. It ebbs and flows. But what I would say with COVID is that there's an opportunity to reset, especially around, and I was very interested in Sarah's slides around flexible working. One of the problems of aging is related to people no longer being economically productive. And the reason they're no longer economically productive is not capacity, but it's the environment for work. Long commutes, cliff's edge retirement, long working hours in factory-like offices and workhouse-like factories. And you know, the problem is not robots taking human jobs, it's humans doing robot jobs. And so if we have an opportunity for a more flexible way of working that would allow people to be economically productive for longer, then you push back the boundary of when people are no longer economically productive. And with that, you push back the ageism that comes with lack of economic productivity. The problem is the way things have been positioned, and I hear this from, I have two sons in their 30s, and they talk endlessly about generational unfairness. Older people with triple locked pensions are protected, and younger people are really suffering through the pandemic and beyond. And so the way, especially in Anglo-Saxon societies and Anglo-American constructs, we've set up this oppositional sense of the different generations, the younger paying for the old. You see this with the hike in national insurance. You know, young people of working age are going to pay for older people's care. Inherited wealth, you're not going to touch it. So there's all kinds of fiscal, economic, labour market frameworks which are keeping the old attitudes in place. And until we break those, I don't think we're going to lose ageism.
We hear a lot in language these days, this idea of privilege that some people are born with, and we're all on this panel have some level of privilege. But the thing about aging is we're all getting old if we're lucky. So this idea of having some sort of privilege, the privilege of the young, well, you've only got that privilege until you age. And then you're there with everybody else and subject to ageism and discrimination. The saying "design for your future selves" is so important. When I used to work as director of customer experience for a dementia care company, we had a mantra that our care homes had to be good enough that we'd put our own mothers there. It turns out people put their mothers in all sorts of horrible places. And we had to change it, that if it wasn't good enough for us, ourselves individually, then stop designing it and do something else and move on. So, but this idea of privilege, is that relevant language that we think in this debate, or is this not a relevant language? Becky, you're nodding, so I'm going to ask you.
Pick on me. I was thinking about how I was going to answer that, and what I've been thinking about as you were talking is that the idea of intergenerational exchange requires people who are not older adults to make space for older adults to be part of an exchange, and that then links back to all of us, right? And I was thinking, so it's a privilege to go to a festival, it's a privilege to go on a protest, it's a privilege to go on a roller coaster. How do we enable those experiences to be open to older adults, and how do we make space and value older people in those environments that we can participate in as younger adults? And I think there's some interesting things around, I just wanted to pick up on the ageism point, because I do think there's something about privilege and how it relates to ageism. I do a lot of work with young people, teenagers, younger adults, and I often hear older people being described as creepy, for example, especially when it comes to men. And now there's a few laughs in the audience. I'm sure you would have heard a younger woman, for example, describing an older man as creepy. Now, they may not have done anything particular to warrant being called creepy. They might have just been present, for example. And actually, that is quite privileged behaviour to describe somebody else as creepy just because they're present in an environment. And it's a really good example of how ageism is very present in the kind of everyday lives of other generations who aren't older adults, and how we all need to make changes in order to deal with our own privilege, or the privilege of being young. I can't say I'm young anymore, but I probably didn't think as much about making space for older people in my own life as we are suggesting, Sarah's suggesting that we need to. So how do we deal with our own privilege as younger people, as middle-aged people, in order to make older people welcome and to deal with our own prejudice and bias?
This leads on to the topic of sort of leadership in this area, and again, maybe Sarah, I'll come to you on this. You know, where is the leadership on this and the sense of urgency to bring about change? In your research, the people that you talk to, who's asking for it, and what are they doing with it?
Well, as I say, so the United Nations has really grasped this. There's been a big debate about whether we need some kind of human rights convention for older people. And I think it's very mixed. Sally Greengross, who is an amazing advocate, she is very, very anti it for this older adult reason. She says, I'm an adult, I don't need special attention. Other people are suggesting that absolutely we do need some kind of protection. And one of the ways the debate has been shifted is to move it away from old age just to things like age. And I remember doing something with the Prince of Wales Trust. I'm just thinking about what Becky's been saying. And the huge amounts of ageist language was coming out, and the people who stood up and said, can we stop this, were the young people. And they said, we feel really discriminated against because we're young. We can identify what you're saying about older people. And they were sort of looking at the people in the middle. So ageism isn't just about older people. It also is about younger people. And I think for what Jeremy was saying, that, you know, this idea that older people are in some ways privileged and are taking resources, this has really gained credence during the pandemic, and that's been the sort of negative side of it. And one of the things that I often say is that if you look at socio-economic inequality, that is the inequality. And when you look at the generations, probably the children of all of us on this panel, they'll be okay, because we have resources and networks that we can pass down within our socio-economic group. And the difference between them and those people who are not of their age, who are not as advantaged, that is where the difference is. And so I think it is a real shame that this intergenerational battle has somehow emerged, and it's very unnecessary.
There was a paper published recently on a workshop I went to, I think it was by King's, the research economist, saying that looking at that generational divide and the war between the generations, and it's saying it just doesn't exist.
No.
It's been manipulated, and there is, as in it does exist, but it's no worse now than it has ever been. If you go back as far as you like, right back to Homer and, you know, and Achilles, there has been differences between the generations, of course there has, but it's no worse now than it has ever been, unless we want to make it worse.
Well, and the other thing that we forget, because COVID, is actually Brexit. And I think Brexit did a huge damage to the reputation of older adults. But if you look at it not by age but by education, it was educated people tended to be on one side, and those who weren't fortunate enough to have education tended to be on the leave side. And most older adults did not have the advantage of education. So education is what has confounded age. And I think that also in this country has been a bit of a problem.
Thank you. I'd like to move on a bit about something that we're tasked to look at, which is that market failure, supply and demand side of things. You know, where is the problem with this? I mean, Nick, the National Institute is designed to bring products, to be innovation, bring products and services to market. Is this a problem that there's not enough people producing goods, or there's not enough people demanding goods? Is it a desirability thing that we've all talked about, that Jeremy very eloquently talked about, or where do you see the problem?
It's a very good point. And again, I don't think there is a precise answer today. I mean, we're just seeing a lot of signals that could be one way or the other. For sure, what we're looking for is convincing the brands that they should have to explore a different narrative, first of all. That goes back to the point, and if I can step back 1 second about the discussion before, I invite everyone to read a fundamental book, which is Simone de Beauvoir, La Jeunesse, 1968. She goes back to the point, it's a class conflict. So if you see from that perspective, then the matter of inequalities and the difference between the generation takes, in my opinion, the real dimension, because then everything else becomes a sort of a overarching narrative, because that's finally, end of the day, it goes back to how society is dealing with itself, which also, again, goes back to a lot of myths. I guess all the brands around us tend to keep on trying to sell a young narrative about their brands. The brands must be cool and young. Cool and young are always in the same sentence. It's not old and young, unless we know the heritage of some brands could be a potential. But you tend to use that heritage sometimes not in the proper way. So probably when we try to push about a new, not ageist narrative, that should have to come through the industries. They could really help us to change the narrative. And there are some industries, entertainment, fashion, obviously, design, where we can start pushing a counter narrative around ageism, probably in the stage of our life, saying it loudly. But in the future, the word ageism should disappear from the background. That's when we will have achieved. It's going to be a long, long way. So the first point is, can we propose things for the people that are not only facing their needs, but also their wants. We tend to forget, and I know Eric is there, which is, we had a discussion today exactly on this point. Can we change some key narratives? There is one I really would like to put on the table. We always talk about independence when we talk about design. And it's obvious that we all are pro-independence, because being independent is very important for us. But I guess we gave a wrong meaning to the word independence. I think we should go back to the point that we are all interdependent, which I think fits well with the intergenerational idea you're putting on the table. We are all interdependent, and be dependent is not something bad. We gave a very bad acception to the word independence, so that if you're dependent, it's bad. Well, this society is based on interdependence. So it's time, in my opinion, we suggest an interdependent design. How we can design things that can show the beauty and the power of dependency as a societal construct as we are. And probably from there we can stimulate the brands to suggest new kind of products that are following this idea. We can explain to people that be connected with others, and you immediately, I guess, you can imagine how many interdependent things we could design. And I guess the garden in the background has the seeds for this idea, right? But I think it's, if we're pushing this narrative out there, so you see how deep is the problem. You just, first of all, to put a word like independence, so that we all agree, and probably independence and autonomy should require some deep investigation between us. But say that if we're able to change the narrative that deep, that probably we'll start solving the issue of how we can design things for a broader demographic, for intergenerational demographic on one hand, so that people can recognize themselves in those products. The last point is that, as we say this morning in another discussion, there is let me say, we tend to stigmatize the people who need this thing as being part of, I would say, is an economic cluster that it's so easy to identify. Sit down on a TV show 2 p.m. and you will see what they're proposing to. So that the point is that if we're able to target messages to that people, we probably also should have to go to some tools, you know, the SEO tool in Google. It's where we can probably suggest also those big players to help us address different suggestions to that demographic. Can be done tomorrow. The point is that nobody's interested because we go back, oh, you bought an escalator for your home, so you are old, that's it. All the products that related to that demographic. Can we also go that deep? And I think we all have the power in this site to make it happen. So goes to some of the big players and suggest them, help us to change the narrative even in the small technicalities, which by the way rule our world.
And Jeremy, I mean, that is partly at the heart of the book, and certainly at the heart of the Helen Hamlin Centre, which I think, did I hear rightly, 300 projects over the 30-year period. And so again, from creating these products and services, you talked about moving away from, you know, that sort of usability, usefulness thing towards desirability. How easy is that in terms of, you know, getting products out there that are desirable, that are full of joy?
Well, it's extremely difficult, and that's why Rama Garabu and I, Rama is the director of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design, it's why we wanted to set up the Design Age Institute. I think we always got, we had some market success, but we always got to a kind of proof of concept, first prototype, and we wanted a mechanism, a vehicle to take it further. That's why we bid for the money with Research England. That's why we pull the partnerships together, and I'm very confident that we'll be able to push it forward. But you know, I would take issue with the idea of market failure, because my experience of trying to push this up the hill over many years, there's not so much market failure as no market at all. And the reason for that is because the state steps in this country. And I saw it with members of my own family, that everyone rolls along, everyone thinks they're invincible. Suddenly you're frail, and you know, it's the activities of daily living, especially bathing. In come the local authority, they do an assessment, they stick in the grab rails, they lower the toilet, They you know, remove the step. You know, it's not cheap to do this stuff, but they do it incredibly expensively and incredibly badly at the same time in many cases. And the state steps in. There isn't a market for this kind of thing. People are not future-proofing their home. And we have to really make things so compelling, so desirable, you know, and without forgetting usability, that people will want to have them. I remember some years ago, Scope, the disability charity, they had a kind of disability summit, and somebody from the sight loss community stood up with an iPhone and said, you know, a standard iPhone has done more for my community than Braille. I thought, that's incredible, you know, that a mainstream product could be so adaptable. That's where we've got to go in the other market segments. Something really...
Can I just pick you up on a bit of language? Because I think there's something really interesting about future-proofing and planning for the future. And when you think about it from the perspective of like when you should start planning for the future, there's sort of this pressure and responsibility on an individual who isn't yet an older adult to start thinking about planning. It's very difficult to imagine. But I think what you're actually saying is that, like the iPhone, the attributes of being able to live well and happily should be embedded in what we're doing rather than forcing us to plan ahead. Because to ask somebody who's dealing with all the issues that they're dealing with at that moment to think 20, 30, 40 years ahead in terms of planning, it's actually, I think, too big an ask of an average person.
I don't think you don't think you need to think 30, 40 years ahead, but maybe think a few. You know, if you're in your 60s, you might think, well, how am I going to deal with this house in my 80s?
I mean, Becky, we worked on this about 6 or 7 years ago with Red and Yellow and the dementia side of things, that, you know, what is the best time to make that move into new accommodation if you've got a diagnosis of dementia? And the answer is as soon as you've got the diagnosis, because if the longer you leave it, the bigger the cold water moment and the harder it is to adapt to your new surroundings. But of course, convincing people to move after the first diagnosis was really, really difficult.
Well, ideally, you should already live in one before you get your dementia diagnosis, right?
But it's the same thing. How do you convince people to stop smoking, to take up exercise, to improve their diet, to do all those things that we know are good for us, no matter what age you are, to be proactive about it? So is there anything that you've seen in these areas? I know you've worked in a variety of those areas that you think, right, and I know there's no secret, but any tricks of the trade about what motivates people?
I think my perspective is it's about reducing cognitive load. So people cannot imagine what life is going to be like for themselves. So this is all about designing for your future self. Designers, you know, in a college situation, it's a real privilege to have the space and time to think about what that might mean. I feel extremely lucky that I've studied funerals and death and dementia care homes and schools and prison if I ever have to go there or know what to do. But I've spent my life learning about environments that other people are experiencing, and I've gotten to witness and think about and plan psychologically about what I might want for myself. But most people don't have that. Most people's lives are taken up with living life and dealing with the problems of life. So we need to make it easy for people, we need to make it motivating. And I think just going back to the social inequalities question, when you think about social inequality, it's not just about income, it's about all of the other factors that affect people's health outcomes. So housing, it's about diet, it's about smoking, alcohol, social connection, green space, all of those other things. It basically brings everything else that are issues in society back into the realm of ageing, because we want people to be living the healthiest, best possible lives they can for as long as possible, because that will mean that they have better lives as older adults. So ageing isn't just about ageing, it's about all of the other social issues that enable people to live well. And I think that's hard, isn't it? Because actually being fit right now as a 40-year-old adult is something that I'm doing for my ageing, but it's also not, it's probably taking away planning for my ageing, because I'm actually trying to do that right now for myself. So I think it's about making things easy and enabling people to do the things that enable them to live good lives now, but also will help them into the future as well, rather than forcing them to undertake an additional activity, which is planning for the future.
Which, if I may, follows what Sarah's saying before. I think we have to start thinking designing for longevity, not for aging, which is a slightly different idea.
Which leads nicely onto my last question before we move on and ask the audience for their questions, and I will try to get the internet to work for the online questions, but if it doesn't, somebody might need to come down with a few bits of paper if there's anybody out there. And that is what role design and designers have in all of this. Because I remember when I was a young designer, we were being beaten up for being environmentally unsound, and it was our job to design to save the planet. The fact that the clients were remarkably uninterested in it, and you go to Tesco in the 1990s and say, you've got to change your materials because you've got to save the planet. It's going to cost you 20% more, but you have to do it. You were just shown the door. But what is the role that designers and architects and planners can have actually in changing this narrative, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of just products and services that are out there? What can we do? Nick, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Well, no, I think I'm not a designer, but I can see from the background I have in looking at the evolution of technologies, how designers today can do a different concept to universal design, which is exactly the opposite, which is hyper-personalized design. Because now we can literally start producing objects for the size of this part of my finger if we want, and we can produce one single piece which is for me. So I think and it could be done. This is one thing. The other one is the exploration that designing with neural networks, for example, can allow us to explore a dimension of not existing design that is generated by machines, that can allow to see how design could be, and that design could be our future self. So we can design the twins of who we are, taking the data coming from the sources that, for example, Sarah suggested before, and design persons that are ourselves without being ourselves. Is it helpful? I'm not sure, but I think it's an interesting challenge on how we can think design for the future self on one hand, and design for the respect of universality of the objects. What Jeremy showed before, it's so much important. But the saucepan already showed, what if it could be designed up to the size of my whistle instead of being a generic whistle? And we know we can do it. So is that the next frontier that we could explore? I think it's an interesting challenge for all of us to designing the universal for the hyper-personal, which is doable, and I guess is probably suggesting new practices that, again, from the Design Age Institute could start, in my opinion.
So I can see you writing furiously, so I'm going to pick on you next and ask you, do you have any thoughts on that from an evidence base or from a research base?
I'm just writing down this wonderful thing, designing universal for the hyper-personal. I think that's amazing.
I'm selling it.
I mean, something that we definitely learned from Jeremy and his colleagues years ago was this idea that if we design for ourselves now and we like it now, then to a certain extent, it should be something that carries us across the life course. And I think in a way that was almost what Becky was saying, that the whole idea about inclusive and this idea of universal design. I always remember you telling me about this screwdriver. What was it? Those people who did that screwdriver that goes like this for older adults. And immediately everyone went, wow, this is wonderful. And I went into gerontology years ago before I had children, and learned all this thing about accessibility and everything. And then I had 3 children and I had pushchairs. And I thought, oh my goodness, now I understand. And again, because we tend to think generationally, we forget that actually there are all sorts of times in our life when it's actually much easier if it was the kind of design that, accepted that many people, aren't sort of male sportsmen that run up and down stairs and do things. So it is really just thinking in an inclusive way and don't think about aging segments, but just think about, I've got one life, I want it to be the best life for as long as I'm on the planet, and I would like an environment that supports me across that life. It's the life course approach. But I'm not a designer.
Jeremy, I'm going to come to you as well on this one.
Well, I've got a very simple answer. The role of a designer is to be creative, is to be imaginative, is to look at these issues and find novel ways of addressing them. And, to Sarah's point about at different life stages, you still face the same problems. One of our allies in the Helen Hamlin Centre is a woman called Patty Moore, who's quite famous 40 years ago for dressing up as an older woman and living on the streets of New York and Philadelphia. But she also designed, she was part of the team that designed the light rail system for Phoenix. And she was trying to get the city authorities to get rid of all steps to make it completely barrier-free, so that wheelchairs could have a smooth run. Anyway, she tried the kind of guilt trip, universal design thing, and the city fathers weren't having it. Then she said, it'd be much easier for businessmen trying to catch a flight with roller luggage, and they all went, yeah, great. So it's finding. I think the role of the designer is to come up with imaginative solutions and find different ways of addressing the issue. And the role of the designer is also to interrogate the problem and not just take a brief from a commercial client. Challenge assumptions. Go back to basics. I love Paul Smith said, I'm childlike. I'm not childish, I'm childlike. And that enabled him to create kind of new categories of clothing. And that's the role of the designer. Thank you.
I think we'll now pass it over to the audience and take Q&A. I can see Eric has got his hand up immediately. I think there's a microphone coming down to you. And if you've got a question for a specific member of the audience, please address it to them. But if not, then I'll happily pick on somebody.
One of the things that was discussed, language and empathy was discussed several times. I think one of the most criminally negligent industries in ageism is the marketing industry, advertising industry, the images that they portray and the stereotypes that they replicate again and again. And as designers, what advice would you give to an industry that fires people when they get over 35? If you're Legal in General, for instance, just changed their marketing agency as a result of retiring stereotypes. They wanted to get rid of the aging stereotype in all of their marketing. So designers are known for having empathy and designing for what would you recommend the marketing industry learn from what you know?
I don't know, I'll pass that question over in a minute, but I remember writing an article myself on this about 20 years ago. I asked the question, where do all the old designers go? Because if you look around the average design studio at that time, nobody was over 40. At that stage, they disappeared somewhere. I came to the conclusion they were all abducted by aliens. It was the only answer I could think of. And nobody complained, so it must have been true. But yes, I mean, I don't know, Jeremy, you have been probably in this business as much as anybody else.
Well, I used to edit the Bible of the advertising industry, Creative Review, and I was always struck by even overtly age-friendly products would be advertised in a way that made no reference to age. My favourite one is Toyota did a car that would take, it was a standard saloon that would take a wheelchair. It was a brilliant piece of automotive design, and the way they advertised it was a very beautiful young double bass player putting her double bass in the back, and you go, I could get a wheelchair in there, and that's how they do it. I don't know, but we do have the world expert on ageism and advertising in the audience in a red suit, so I'm going to hand over to George Lee to answer this question.
For those who don't know, George Lee is our community manager at the Design Ed Institute, but also a leading figure.
George has really been studying this.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Well, Eric, we can talk about this later then. No, but I think it's a really good point, and I mean it's talking about creative review. I mean, we've done a lot of work with creative review, haven't we, Jeremy, over the number of years, and I was speaking to the Eliza Williams, who is the new editor, and they're about to do their third issue around age in creative review. They've been doing it for the last about 12 years. And I was speaking to Eliza, and she was saying, why has nothing changed? Why has nothing changed? We're talking about it, we're still saying the same things, but nothing has really changed. And the inbuilt ageism within all of us. And I think that I was speaking to the head of Getty Images the other day, and she was saying that photographers are ageist. It's our own internal ageism that we need to work on. And I think that one of the things we're trying to do at the Design Age Institute is to share more positive stories. I think the more we do it, the more we will change it. Interestingly, speaking to the Getty Images lady, she was saying that their new specialist image library, which is all about positive images of aging, are the most successful selling images. So the idea is you do a good campaign, you do a good image, and it makes a difference. So, for example, Rankin did a big project recently around sex and intimacy for Relate. I don't know if you've seen the images, absolutely beautiful images of real older people across the ages. 2 billion hits of those images. So I think that it goes back to good design. It goes back to good design. And as you were saying, Colin, good design becomes invisible. But good advertising, good photography, good marketing, that makes a big difference. So I think we just need more of those. We need to champion more of those, and we will be. So yeah.
I guess, Eric, sorry, just making a problem probably to myself because I don't have the answer. But one of the points he was making, and the question, in my opinion, to all of us is, are younger designers and advertisers better than older ones, or vice versa? Because I think the question is experience in understanding, and I guess it's back to your point about observing the others. How much experience count in changing this game? And I think it's probably one of the discussions that could open a huge debate, in my opinion. And again, I don't want to get out there, but I think it's something, as we're looking, for example, advertising agency laying off the older creatives, and then who knows about the understanding of all the process of life that you acquired about your life. So the importance of bringing back the intelligence of everyone in the process of redesigning the world that we're discussing about today, it's probably one of the questions we have, and I guess could be probably discussed. The other point about pictures you touch, I guess, is the lack of authenticity. In the center, we try to give ourselves a mission that we still haven't accomplished, to have 100% free from stock pictures in everything we do, which is a challenge. And it is, honestly, because then it requires a lot of effort to make it properly, because you have to find the right photographers, you have the people that you think represent that demographic, which again, it's a pretty interesting discussion if you see the advertising out now. Probably you also noticed there are many brands which tend to, let me say, flatten the images from, I would say, a discrimination perspective. Ethnicity, age again, are becoming a sort of nuances which are leading us to, let me say, raceless, sexless, ageless attempt to do something which is so good for everyone, which get to a point that we're losing some identity even there. So getting the right identity of this demographic that we would like to engage, I think it's another interesting challenge that we all have, and maybe we can suggest the industries how we can overcome this point, because again, try to be compliant with all the possible diversities tends to make everything white or black, or for a designer black. So, or beige,
yeah.
Exactly.
Sarah.
So as you've been talking, I've just been thinking, so you obviously talk about things relevant to genetics and personalised medicine and whatever, but one of the really big other things that we're finding through brain scans and brain imagery is really understanding what happens to us as we get older.
Yeah.
And there's this massive amount of work that is now being taken quite seriously around this different intelligence, which is, I think, is what you're talking about, and this idea that we have this fluid intelligence, which is quick and snappy, and then we have this crystallized intelligence, which we start to get, and it peaks in our 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And if you think that the kind of world we're moving into, which isn't just a knowledge economy, which obviously crystallized intelligence is very important in, but an economy where robots are taking away jobs, and the thing that my understanding is that AI can do at the moment is the fluid intelligence bit. Yeah. That's what it's good at. It's not so good at the crystallized intelligence, which is what older adults are good at. And it's just a matter of getting that story out and repeating it, that it isn't that you, as you age, you lose everything. You actually gain things. And hopefully that scientific knowledge through the media, and it isn't just advertisers, it's also very sadly younger journalists. Probably, I'm not sure why, but they can be incredibly ageist without even realising it. I mean, I think you're right. Maybe this is something we have to teach at schools, just naturally introduce older adults into education. And I remember doing a Channel 4 interview on that longevity story about how long will that cohort live, and the fact that people in Britain, half of us were going to live to 103, and they put up behind me 2 old ladies with shopping baskets. And I went, where are the babies? We're talking about babies here, the babies that have been born. But as soon as you said old, it was old ladies with shopping baskets.
It's interesting that we talk about this at the Institute, and George and I have had lots of discussions about this in the past. You can have a Channel 4 television programme called Lodgers for Codgers. And that's on, that's somehow acceptable. Change that word codgers for anything else of a minority group, and you see what will happen to that television programme. But it seems to be there with all of us, and it's in all of us. This is not a them. This is an us. Even when we first all got together, we created images of ourselves 20 years older or 30 years older, designing for your future selves. And when we first saw them, we all went, hang on, why did we just go? Just because you're older does not mean anything other than you are older. But yet we still have that programmed in us, that sharp intake of breath, looking at yourself older. But I'd like to go back to that wisdom thing, because I think that's, it's something we talk about. It's one thing, as you age, you have more opportunity for knowledge and experience and to reflect on it and to build wisdom. And again, Jeremy, I'm going to come to you for this and just say, how does that affect the way we buy things, the way we design things, the way we live our lives, this idea of having wisdom? What do you buy now that you wouldn't have bought when you're young, and what wouldn't you buy now that you might have bought when you were young?
Well, you see, I'm 65, and I don't regard... It would be interesting to ask the audience, actually, whether they think I'm old or young or merely middle-aged. I'm still trying to work out what I'm going to do when I grow up. I'm not sure how my buying habits have changed. I'm not kind of... I know how lockdown has affected me, and it's affected me in the same way it's affected a lot of people. I'm very optimistic about COVID having some positive effects for this whole debate, because it's made people much more sensitive to their environment. The thing that unites designers and social scientists in the age space is our theories of environmental press, the fit between people and their environment. And I think we were all rushing around and moving so fast and going here and going there, that we became desensitized to our local environment and our home environment. We'd come in, go out, and we never gave it a second thought. But now people have had some considerable time to think about I know I have. And you think, well, is this the right environment for me? Do I need more green space? Do I need more space? Do I need less space? How does it fit my feelings? And this whole environmental fit thing, I think, is going to change consumer habits. I'd be very interested to hear, people's experiences in the audience, how they think that COVID is going to change spending habits or buying habits.
Well, I'd like to, again, so I'll push it over to the audience.
Thoughts,
if anybody's got any comments or thoughts, or even more questions for us, we still have some time left. I notice there's not too many coming through on the internet. There is, although my internet might not be working, so that might be why, but we'll see. But if there's any more questions for us or comments, yeah.
I think I've got a comment about Amazon, which I think has been a real beneficiary of COVID, and yet what they're doing is ruining intergenerational opportunities by decimating social care working patterns, in that it's an unpleasant job, it's not well paid to go and be a carer, and yet Amazon's offering huge sign-up bonuses, people can work fewer days, people aren't doing their normal shopping as they would have done before, and yet Amazon's still making profit, and yet, social care burden in terms of finding those people, we're all having to pay more tax, that's going to get worse, and yet Amazon has absolutely no impact. So an idea that I'd been thinking is, can't the government, and if they can't even collect the taxes from them properly, couldn't they be sort of shamed into giving back in order to sort of support the intergenerational kind of problems that they are partly accelerating? I don't know if anyone has had that kind of thought.
I don't know who to offer that question to, so I shall let volunteers from the panel who would like to comment on that, because I think it's an interesting point.
Very interesting point.
The power of Amazon and the big retailers. I mean, when I worked for Tesco, which I suppose was the Amazon of its day back in the 90s, they had an expression that people vote with their wallets, you know, and that's how they shop. If people come and spend money in our store, it's because they like it. If they don't, we're doing something wrong. And I'm just wondering how Amazon now is playing into that. But do people actually have the choice? And that's the problem. Maybe it's the lack of choice that huge organisations like Amazon are producing.
I mean, I don't know much about Amazon, but I do think you've raised this really important thing about care workers, because it isn't just pay, it's also status and training. And some of the statements, sadly, that the current government is putting out, like, well, you know, if you need a job, you can always be a care worker. You would never say, oh, if you need a job, you can always be a maternity nurse. You know, and again, it feeds back into this idea that, you know, if you're an old person, well, anyone can actually do that job. And I would hope that we would get a huge wake-up call that we don't just have to pay our care workers well, but we've also got to train them, give them some kind of recognition, some kind of status, so that people actually want to go into it.
I think one of somebody was making the point before we started that at least other occupations, they get to sit around and have a cigarette and chat, where care workers don't even get that opportunity. You know, they're generally speaking working on their own in isolation with not a lot of thanks. So yeah, I'm afraid we don't think we answered your question, which probably means it's a good question.
Yeah. No, but
No, I think I think it's very on topic. I'll pick up on the other side of the Amazon side of things. I mean, while offices have been closed for 18 months and knowledge workers have all been at home having endless Zoom calls, the logistics and warehousing industry has gone through the roof. I was looking at some real estate data this week. There's a massive boom in logistics and warehousing, and the people who work in those industries are getting very militant, and they've got a labour shortage, and they're raising the pay package and the benefits quite dramatically, as you describe, to pull people in. And it's going to pull people away from other sectors. I mean, the government's announcement, you know, I'm sorry to come back to the national insurance hike, but, you know, oh, we fixed social care. No, they've not fixed anything, you know. And I think it, you know, I think a big part of the future of ageing is the future of care for ageing. And there's a lot of innovation to be done in that area.
There was one final question, was there, or something?
Yeah, you can take time, actually.
Oh,
Well, that's fine now.
no, it's okay. I think there's.
Yeah, you go.
So there's one here.
And this lady here.
So yeah, I think we've got time for. Sorry.
And this lady here.
Yeah. I'll take a couple.
Well, thank you very much for this panel. It's been great. I just wanted to ask to Jeremy and all the panel, if possible. You were saying that everybody thinks they're invisible, and probably there's this gap between the market and the supply. But what happens, it would be a short-term solution, putting in like Toyota with this advertisement, possibly thinking about the carer of the people. That could be a short-term solution for putting this type of products to the market. But then, do you think this the market will evolve also as well after this COVID situation? Like, and now, as you say, everybody is more conscious about our environment. Are we thinking about this future-proofing now, or when do you think this is going to happen?
I think it's going to happen in different ways and in different times, depending on the individual. I think it's very, very difficult when you're in the meat of a career and you're raising a family. You're not thinking about when you're older. Your horizons are fairly short term, and I think there has to be, if we're going to kind of transform or create a market, then there have to be innovations that are so interesting and attractive that people go, well, you know, I want to have some of that. And I don't think that the kinds of things that I've been involved in over the last 30 odd years are necessarily relevant today. You know, one of my motivations this evening was to hear new concepts, and I find the idea of interdependent design, moving from dependence to interdependence, I think is absolutely a kind of fundamental and quite profound shift. I'm going to add it to my slide. I haven't really answered your question because I really don't know the answer.
So one final question here, if we will, before we wrap up.
Yeah, I was just wondering how I've been researching good products for older generations, people who are disabled, for many years now, and nothing has really changed. Great designs come out, but they disappear because manufacturers just aren't interested, particularly when it comes to wheelchairs. I just wondered how you would propose these great designs being adopted by manufacturers.
I might take that.
Yeah.
Thank you. As you know, as well as I do, there's no simple answer. The answer comes from you know, market failure, whether it exists or not, or what that means. But there's got to be a demand side. So people have to want to spend maybe a little bit more, or not a little bit more if we can do it well, on something that's better. And we have to convince manufacturers to embrace that. But like it is in the NHS, we've got to get away from this cottage industry mentality of manufacturing things where there's 20 organisations throughout the country making 10 each. You know, every time there's an order, they make another 10, because then they can't scale up. There isn't the investment. They can't use modern materials. They're still just welding bits of metal together and painting them black and sticking wheels on them and saying, there you go. And therefore, so it's kind of a national and or global marketplace driven by demand, not supply. So I am a firm believer, and it's one of my summing up notes, which I'll do sitting down, that if we can point the market in the right place and say, here's what people want, and we can help them through the Design Age Institute and some of our programs, you know, reach the best design in the country and develop something really desirable, then people will buy it. But it's as yet unproven because we're still in this cottage industry mentality where we make things off in small batch runs. Lady Helen Hamlin did announce at our launch event the Walker Challenge, which she's going to fund, which is looking at a walking frame and trying to design in desire and away from these stigmatizing frames that look awful. And that is going to be one of our challenges as to what that means and how can we work with the manufacturer who will mass produce an attractive walker rather than batch produce lumps of metal welded together.
Yeah, I watched that with interest because there was actually something that has been manufactured and that is being sold that is completely different from a walker point of view. So products do exist, and they tend to be made in Scandinavian countries rather than in the UK. I don't know why the UK don't want to do this.
Well, it's a program that, and Fiona's in the audience as well, another one of our senior design managers. We've spent 10 or 15 years working with the Design Council looking at that problem. We have a great manufacturing and technology industry. We have a great design industry. They just don't talk to each other. The idea is how do you bring those together to try to get design into manufacturing. And it has improved, but it's also part of what the Design Age Institute's role is. So I can't say after a year we've solved it, but it's definitely on our agenda. Fiona, do you want to?
Well, I'd just say we've got Eric here as well doing set of robotics
Sinead,
and
you
bringing.
know of it, I
Yeah.
Yeah, you've caught me, we quote her.
Yeah. You do?
Yes.
Yes.
So you speak each other, you see?
Because we are working on bringing to market, or Eric is, with a very attractive, you know, future thinking.
She called it the apple of the wheelchair.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I think we're right out of time and a little bit beyond, so it's left to me now just to close it all up. And I had a list of things I might have said, but actually I'm just going to say design universal for the hyper-personal, which is something that I'm going to steal and write down and pretend is mine.
It's recorded, that's your problem.
Absolutely.
I want the recording of it.
And that independent design as well. You know, great ideas and design longevity. You know, lots of wonderful words coming out that are themes that we've been talking about throughout the whole event. But I think what I'm taking from this is that if you bring great research, great inclusive design together, you can have a big difference and you can change the world. Well, half of it anyway. The other half, I think Mother Nature will still control. So, actually, please look at our next event coming up. George will be very proud of this. This is her baby, the Wisdom Hour. This is one of our next events coming up on the 2nd of October, so please look out for that. That's it, yes. And we have another series in these talks coming up as well, so just keep an eye out. Please go onto our website, register for feedback if you wish. So there's lots of things coming up. Before we go, just a big thank you to all turning out in person, and for those online who have logged in, and thank you to our panellists for their great contribution in giving up their evening. And just to say, Georgia and Elliot, I think, are waiting outside. Have your cards ready or you won't be allowed out.
That's a minute.
Yeah.
Is that yours?
Very nice.